Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm Jeff Howe, joined by CJ Vogel. Time to talk a little team intel on Easter weekend. And this edition of On Texas Football brought to you by Andy Ludicky and My Perfect Franchise. Telling you more about My Perfect Franchise coming up later in the show. But CJ, Sark changed the practice schedule around. They were supposed to practice on Friday, but he decided, nope, scrap that. We'll do a scrimmage Thursday night. So an extended Easter break for this team. Probably a good call by Sark. Get one last really good practice in before the team gets a few days off. We've got notes on that over at ontexasfootball.com. Blake Monroe posted some notes on Friday. CJ, before we get started here, anything in that stand out to you? Because I'll be honest, the one thing that really stood out to me was I'm kind of just, names popping up again. And we know tight end is a position where Texas is looking in the transfer portal for some options. The fact that Emory Winston's name keeps coming up, I'm taking that as a good sign.
Yeah, he's been a pleasant surprise, and I'm not sure I was expecting this coming into the year. There's a lot of questions coming out of high school whether or not he would be fit physically for the tight end spot, right? He's only about 6'1" and a quarter, 6'1" and a half, but he's 240 pounds, and I think he plays much larger than his frame would insist. And, of course, you see him run routes, Jeff, and we got to see that very early in the spring session. It looks natural to him, right? He moves like a wide receiver. He catches a football like a wide receiver. Now, how much can his body get him prepared for life in the trenches as a tight end in the SEC? That's going to be really interesting. But so far, a really positive spring for him. Of course, he's getting a lot of reps. He and Spencer Shannon splitting that first team group reps right now at the tight end spot. Of course, no Jordan Washington, who's dinged up with a clavicle, and he's getting closer to the return on the field. But right now, very valuable in the long run for Emory Winston currently.
Yeah, I hope I've said this from the start, CJ. I hope he ends up being for Texas, kind of like what Trey Millard and Dimitri Flowers were for OU back in the day. They can line up at tight end, they can line up in the backfield. They're ideally best functional as H-backs, but basically a jumbo offensive weapon that you can move around and do some different things with. I've said that about Michael Terry too. I said Michael Terry's kind of a better version of those guys. Michael Terry's still adjusting to wide receiver, still learning it, but Emory Winston jumping right in, getting some time at tight end. You mentioned he's been a pleasant surprise, and CJ, that's what I want to do with this video, with this edition of On Texas Football. Spring surprises on both sides of the ball, and I'll let you start on offense. I don't know if you were going to go with Winston, but what has surprised you the most given the intel we've heard and what we've picked up from Sark and the players so far?
Yeah, Winston certainly deserves some sort of honorable mention in this pleasant surprise conversation on the offensive side of the ball for the spring, but I have to stick with wide receiver, right? I got to go out wide. Look, there's plenty of guys I could pick, right? One would be Parker Livingstone from the very beginning. We've heard his name pretty often, but I'll stick with Dalen McCutcheon.
Yeah.
To get those first team reps as often as he has as a true freshman, as a guy who coming into the spring, you talk about that really, really talented wide receiver class in 2025. McCutcheon's name kind of fell through the wayside, right? It wasn't one that was catching headlines. It wasn't one that was necessarily popping up on, the recruiting class rankings, et cetera. Yet he's been very steady. Of course, we've talked about it. I've said from the get-go, his route running ability will be above and among the best on campus from the very start of his Texas career. And I hear that's, to the standard currently.
Mm-hmm.
But on top of that, just the ability to pick up on the playbook. That's not an easy playbook, especially for a slot guy. But with no DeAndre Moore, he's filled in seamlessly. And I don't know how much we'll see him this fall, but I do think after the spring, Jeff, he's going to be in a position where the staff trusts him enough to get some runs should his number be called in the fall.
I'm going to give an honorable mention to Christian Clark and James Simon, because those are the two names of running back that we've heard the most. Look at Trey Wisner, said it before, I'll say it again. Just make sure he gets to Columbus against Ohio State and he's fine. You know what you've got with him. And he's had a productive spring and shown some growth, but you know what you got with Trey Wisner. And, Christian Clark coming back from the injury, James Simon coming in as a true freshman. I like what both those guys have done. But I'm going to go to the offensive line, CJ, and the fact that Cole Hudson and DJ Campbell have taken these leadership roles seriously. They've taken the ball and they've run with it. And I like Cole Hudson kind of being the guy in his senior year that's going to bridge the gap between Jake Majors and Daniel Cruz at center. You think about this run of centers Texas has had, which has been actually, even though some of the years have been lean for the program, it's been a really good run of centers going from Dominic Espinosa to Zach Shackelford to Jake Majors, all of those guys had to start as redshirt freshmen, or in Shackelford's case, as a true freshman.
Right.
That's not ideal. You don't want to throw a young center in there, and we've seen the issues that presents. So I think Cole Hudson, played a lot of football, started 13 games as a freshman at guard, moving over to center. This is his opportunity in his senior year to start, and it sounds like he's taken on that leadership role seriously and can solidify that center position. And if Sark is right, that this is the best version of DJ Campbell that Texas has gotten since he's been on campus, and Arch Manning is right that DJ Campbell's been good for the locker room in addition to what he brings to the table as a player, CJ, he could have that all SEC type year where maybe we're talking about DJ Campbell being, kind of that day 2 draft pick, maybe early day 3 draft pick that we all kind of envisioned him to be. I know that he wanted to be, to have the opportunity to come out. Maybe he can be that type of guy by the end of 2025.
The physical tools were always there for DJ, right? Coming in as a 5-star guy, he was the number 1 overall guard in his recruiting class. And, it took him a little bit into college to really get the swing of things. And of course, over the 23-24 season, he played well, right? And of course, there was a platoon with Cole Hudson. I think for DJ, it was all about finding that confidence. And going into 25, he's certainly the guy, right? There's no dispute about who will be the right guard in 2025 for the Texas Longhorns. It will be DJ Campbell. The one thing that's really caught up for him is the mental aspect, right? It was always hey, will the communication, will the vision, will the pickup on twists, stunts, other et cetera, blitzes, will that be there for DJ Campbell? That was an issue early on, and I think it was pretty underrated, or at least under talked about, the ability of a Cam Williams and a DJ Campbell to gel the way that they did on the right side of the offensive line. I know Texas fans are probably sitting there saying, no, man, there were sacks all the time from that side. Not really, right? And we knew going into that season that's exactly where opposing teams in the front 7 were going to target the Texas Longhorns, to go into Michigan and to stymie a really good front 7 the way that they did. Look, I don't think DJ Campbell in pass protection is a liability, and I know it's not going to be for 2025. My point being, to take that next step up for the Longhorns, it would be huge for DJ Campbell, who, again, I think is playing with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, considering, hey, everybody else in that room from a year ago is gone, and he's just the one that remains aside from Cole Hudson.
I'll throw in a caveat, too, to what you said about Cam Williams. Now we know that against Ohio State, and you could tell he wasn't 100%, he was playing on a knee that basically rendered him sidelined, knocked him out of the entire pre-draft process. So it was a knee injury that was a lot worse than I think what was initially led to believe that it was. And we knew Trevor Goolsby was locked in at left tackle. But once you get your center position figured out, and you figure out, okay, DJ Campbell's going to hang on to this. Not only is he going to hang on to right guard, but he's going to take it and run with it. Now it's easier to get Neto into the mix at left guard. And it looks like Brandon Baker's going to end the spring holding off Andre Kojo and Nick Brooks at right tackle. All of a sudden, CJ, this offensive line's starting to come together and looking like, okay, this is a group that can get Texas into title contention in the SEC. And when you talk about contending for titles in the SEC, you're talking about contending for a college football playoff spot, which is exactly where Texas wants to be for the 3rd year in a row. We'll talk about defense here in just a second, but before we do that, let me tell you about today's sponsor. That is Andy Ludicky and My Perfect Franchise. Are you stuck in the corporate rat race with 2 weeks PTO and no control over the money you can make or your schedule in general? Well, call Andy. He'll take you through a process that'll help you find a business that will fit the skill sets and your financial goals that you're looking for. Franchise ownership isn't for everyone, but if you have a desire to take control of your destiny, call Andy or email him at andy@myperfectfranchise.net or call him at 404-973-9901. Again, that's Andy Ludicky at myperfectfranchise.net. Email him, andy@myperfectfranchise.net. All right, CJ, let's go over to defense. We talked pleasant surprises on offense. What stood out to you on defense? Who's been that surprise for you over on that side of the ball?
Yeah, it's just how tight that cornerback battle is. And I think specifically it's Warren Roberson, it's Kobe Black, the 2 names I think we've heard the most about so far this spring, right? We know Colin Simmons is going to be Colin Simmons. Anthony Hill is going to be Anthony Hill. We expect Michael Taft to continue his All-American level of play in the back end as well. But, hey, to find that guy opposite of Manny Muhammad, to find who can kind of rotate in with the Jalen Gilbo, I love what I'm hearing right now from a Kobe Black. I love what I'm hearing from a Warren Roberson, who, again, I've mentioned this before, Jeff, but, when you go into year 3 at the University of Texas or school of that caliber and you've yet to really crack the lineup, well, there's going to be some questions about whether or not this is the school or the level of football for you. So for Warren Roberson to really take that next leap and to become a guy in that conversation for cornerback and potentially even steal that starting job, depending on the matchup and the type of play that Texas wants to deploy out in its coverage on the outside, that's really encouraging. So I'm all for it. And again, I think in man coverage is really where you're going to see him start to thrive as a corner.
We've heard throughout the spring Warren Roberson's name mentioned, Kobe Black's been mentioned, Grayson Littleton's been mentioned, Cade Phillips has been mentioned at times, and like you said, Jalen Gilbo over there playing corner. So Texas has enough depth and versatility, CJ, that they can be almost opponent specific based on how they deploy their personnel this season. That was going to be my answer, but at the risk of not just going with your answer and being different for the sake of content, I'm going to say the depth and versatility at linebacker. Like, we knew edge was deep and it was good. I didn't know that it was going to be deep enough and good enough that the staff could tinker with moving Trey Moore off the ball and having him play more of a traditional linebacker role. We know Anthony Hill is a proven pass rusher, and we know Brad Spence was a really good pass rusher at Arkansas. But now you throw Trey Moore in there. It's 3 linebackers you can put on the field at the same time that can all rush the passer. You've still got Leunga Lafau. Ty Anthony Smith is still coming along, and I think he's ideally a fit as a dime linebacker right now. You can get him on the field and your sub packages. And then do we see a young guy like Bo Barnes, who Anthony Hill's kind of taken under his wing? And maybe Bo Barnes is the next big-time guy in that linebacker room. So, CJ, it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about linebacker in this program as kind of, are they going to figure it out? Or do they know what they're looking for with off-ball linebacker? Can they get the kind of personnel that can be 3-down guys? Not only do they have 3-down guys in that room, they've got guys that can be sub-package guys that can wreak havoc from the second level. And I don't think Pete Kwiatkowski, I could be wrong on this, I don't think he's ever going to be a really high blitz rate guy. But the organic pressure you can get from the second level, on top of the fact that you've still got a Colin Simmons and, Ethan Burke's got pass rush potential at edge, CJ, the options are endless in terms of how Texas can get after the quarterback this year without having to blitz and leave your secondary vulnerable.
I'm looking at the games you could play, right, where you can line up these guys. We saw it at times with like a DeMarvion Overshone, lining right up over the nose. We saw it, I think, really in Tuscaloosa against Alabama. The way you could deploy Anthony Hill very early in his career is now, it's minute in terms of what that usage rate is like for him blitzing. And still, to your point, we don't see it all that often, right? Yeah. But when we do, it's very effective, right? 8 sacks last year for Anthony Hill, over 40 pressure, like a tremendous ability to get after quarterback, and it's all natural. So what can you do with a guy like Brad Spence, who had 4.5 sacks at Arkansas a year ago? Well, I think now you can put them side by side and show get pressures right there. It's not an easy thing for opposing offensive lines to defend, and we've already heard that ability for the Texas offensive line to have some sort of communication errors or gaps there it's going to continue. And this is a team that sees the opposing defense every single day this spring, so I can only imagine what type of communication errors or identification keys that are missed in just 1 week of prep. I think Texas is in a great spot with that.
CJ, I gave an honorable mention on offense to Christian Clark and James Simon. So I'll give one on defense in terms of spring surprises. As loaded as this defensive line is, and it sounds like Cole Brevard heard his name pop up more later in spring practice as of late. But the fact that Lance Jackson and Justice Terry have been able to get enough snaps to create some buzz on a defensive line that's got a ton of veterans, a lot of guys that have played a lot of football, a lot of impact players, especially at edge, that bodes well for the future, because if these guys are making noise right now, you have to feel like they're going to make a ton of noise, that the defensive line play at Texas isn't going to drop off once Lance Jackson and Justice Terry are counted on to play real live significant snaps.
No, it's always fun whenever you bring in the number one recruiting class, and the biggest highlight of that recruiting class itself is that front seven, right? Specifically the edge rushers, specifically the defensive line. And with Lance Jackson specifically, we heard from Colin Simmons earlier in the week saying he's going to be a future first-round pick. I think Colin Simmons knows what it takes to be a first-round pick, right? He is certainly look, I'll put it this way. if he's not a first-round pick, Jeff, I'll find a new job, right? I'm putting the job on the line. I do that once probably every year. That's going to be my job or my bet that lingers about 2 years down the road. But point being, Lance Jackson going to be pretty darn good. And look, Justice Terry, I think it was a quieter spring for him, especially being one of the more coveted defensive linemen coming into spring camp for the Longhorns here. But hey, I've heard over the last week or so, the last 3-4 practices have been his best. He's kind of clicked in terms of when the pads are on, where to shoot your hands, how to align, what type of first steps do you need given the situation and movement of the offensive line. That's all encouraging because at some point this year, his number will be called, and whether it's at 3, whether it's at an edge spot, he's going to be utilized for the Longhorns.
Just like to remind everybody, when we talk about the freshmen, Nick Townsend's still in high school, and Jonah Williams is playing baseball right now. So you still got some important pieces in this class that still haven't really been actively involved in this program yet. So even more good stuff to come during the summer. CJ, thank you so much for the time, and thanks to everybody for tuning in to this weekend edition of On Texas Football. Again, want to thank our sponsor, My Perfect Franchise. That's Andy Ludicky at myperfectfranchise.net. Reach out to him, Andy at myperfectfranchise.net. Thanks to the entire On Texas Football staff. Don't forget, get over to ontexasfootball.com. 1 year of access for only $49.95. Just use the promo code OTFOG. That's OTFOG. You get 1 year of access at ontexasfootball.com for $49.95. You do not want to miss it. On behalf of the entire On Texas Football staff and for CJ Vogel, I'm Jeff Howe. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, hook 'em.
Welcome. Happy Easter.